In this lecture, we will give a brief introduction to the book of Exodus. First of all, the title of the book of Exodus, both in English and in Hebrew. The English title, Exodus, means going out. It's derived from the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, where the Greek title is a combination of two words, ek, which is Greek for from, and hodos, which means road or way, and so exodos means the road out, as it were. This title refers specifically to Israel's going out from Egypt. In the book of Exodus, Israel goes out of Egypt and sets out towards the Promised Land. The Hebrew title is based on the first words of the book of Exodus, and that's the way the whole Pentateuch works. The Hebrew titles are based on the first few words. And in the Hebrew, it begins with Ele Shemot B'nai Yisrael, and these are the names of the sons of Israel. And so they take that Hebrew title, the Ele Shemot, the first three words, and really focus in only on one of them, Shemot, which means name. That means and Ele means these, and these are the names. It takes the word for names, and that becomes the title of the book, Names, Shemot. And it goes on to say these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, and it starts listing those that did. Let's move on to the historical backdrop of the book of Exodus, particularly Egyptian names in the book of Exodus, the Hyksos period as a backdrop to the book of Exodus, and the date of the Exodus. It looks like several of the names in the book of Exodus may have Egyptian derivations. Among them are Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. The name Moses, Hebrew Moshe, is probably a shortened form of an Egyptian name. Now there's some debate on this, but I will make the case that it's a shortened form of an Egyptian name. Many Egyptian pharaohs had elements of their name that sounds like Moses. Ramses, for example, consists of two elements, Ra or Re, and Moses or Moses, meaning begotten of the god Re. Or Thutmose similarly consists of two elements, Thut and Mos, meaning begotten of the god Thoth. In these and similar names, beginning the element that sounds like Moses means begotten of a divine name. Now, if Moses is derived from Egyptian, the pagan divine part element of Moses' name was dropped off for obvious reasons. They didn't want to glorify a pagan god. Moses sounds like the Hebrew verb meaning to draw water, and a word play is made on that in Exodus 2 and verse 10. In the story, Moses was drawn from the water. And of course, Moses ended up being raised by Pharaoh's daughter, who naturally would think in terms of the Egyptian meaning of his name. But Moses' mother would think of it according to its Hebrew derivation. Now, we have no historical records from Egypt that specifically refer to Israel's 4th-century sojourn in Egypt, but Moses' name would seem to fit the Egyptian context. Miriam and Aaron may also be Egyptian in derivation. The names Miriam, sister of Moses, and Aaron, the brother of Moses, have no obvious derivations in Hebrew. They too may be Egyptian. Aaron could be Egyptian for the name of the god is great. And Miriam may be derived from Egyptian Marieh, beloved. The historical backdrop of the book of Exodus begins with the story of the Hyksos. It turns out that a large number of Semites were migrating to Egypt. They came from Asia through Palestine in the first part of the second millennium BC. You have evidence of this in Amenemhet's Wall of the Ruler. Around 1991 BC, according to one Egyptian chronology, there's actually several, but that's a long story. But we'll say approximately 1991 BC, Amenemhet I, founder of the 12th dynasty, built a series of fortifications at Suez named the Wall of the Ruler, and the purpose of these fortifications was to keep the Semites out of Egypt. Kind of like the Great Wall of China, built to keep the mongrels out, or the fence between Mexico and the United States meant to keep Mexicans out. And the reason they built this was clearly there was an influx of Asiatics that was becoming a problem. Another piece of evidence is the story of Sinuhe. It's an Egyptian text that dates to about this date, in which Sinuhe traveled to Palestine and met a Palestinian sheikh who had visited Egypt. And it shows that there was considerable freedom for Semites to travel to Egypt. Semites even began showing up in the artwork during the 12th dynasty, which nominally dates from 1991 to 1786 BC. We have a tomb painting which shows 37 Semitic tribesmen headed by a sheikh with a Hebrew-sounding name, Abisharu. We also see that Semites show up as domestic servants. And so beginning in the 13th dynasty, which begins around 1786, there is evidence of Semites in Egypt as domestic servants. The next stage is when the Semites take over the joint. This is called the Hyksos period. From around 1674 to around 1567, a greater part of Lower Egypt you might see on the map here, is the Nile Delta region. It's called lower because it's lower in altitude. But anyway, Lower Egypt came to be controlled by non-native Egyptians, apparently Semites, who were known as the Hyksos. But then the next stage comes when Ahmose drives the Hyksos out of Egypt. Around 1558, Pharaoh Hyksos succeeded in driving the Hyksos non-Egyptian rulers out of Egypt, and at this point Lower Egypt returned to native Egyptian rule after more than a century of Semitic rule. Well, what's the significance of all this? Well, it helps to explain why the Egyptians chose to oppress the Hebrews. Jacob entered Egypt at a time when many Asiatics or Semites were entering the land, and when the Hyksos came into power, the Egyptians presumably prospered under those Semitic rulers. But in 1558, the Semitic rulers of the Hyksos were expelled by Ahmose, and native Egyptians took, naturally enough, oppressive measures against Asiatics, who would mostly be Semites, to keep them from ever taking over any of Egypt again. Hence the Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, as is mentioned in Exodus 1 and verse 9, who began the oppression, is a Hyksos Pharaoh, possibly Ahmose himself. The oppression is understandable given the historical circumstances. The Egyptians did not want non-natives ever to rise up and take control of Egypt again.